Welcome to Military Analytics. Things are not going well for the Russian army invading Ukraine. 2023 has started very badly for Russia. The Ukrainian army is winning very important victories against Russia's invasion attempt. Tanks of the Russian army have been destroyed. The Ukrainian army is getting closer to victory. Step by step. The war between Russia and Ukraine has been raging around Bakhmut for the last month. There have also been major clashes in the city of Salvador in recent days. The Russian army is doing everything it can to capture these areas, but the Ukrainian army is preventing these operations from succeeding. Ukrainian President Zelensky made a very important statement about the clashes in these regions. There is no such piece of land near these two cities where the invader would not give his life for the crazy ideas of the masters of the Russian regime, Zelensky said. Zelensky also said the following: Bakhmut is resisting against all odds, even though most of the city has been destroyed by Russian attacks. Our fighters are repelling constant attempts at Russian aggression there. Solidarity is also holding out, although there is even more destruction there, and it is extremely difficult. Both of these towns are in Donetsk Oblast. The Russian government has been preparing to invade Donetsk for years. There was a lot of propaganda directed at Ukrainian citizens of Russian origin living in Donetsk. However, the Ukrainian people never supported Russia's invasion attempt. The Ukrainian army carried out important operations in these regions. Russia was planning to invade Ukraine and take over the whole country after the successful resistance of the Ukrainian army. It revised its goals. The Kremlin administration decided to annex Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions in Ukraine. However, the Ukrainian government did not recognize this decision and continued its operations. Russia was forced to withdraw from Kherson, but fighting continues in other three regions. It is not a coincidence that the fighting has continued in the Donetsk region in recent days. The Russian army wants to completely dominate Donetsk. The Ukrainian army is determined not to allow this. The Russian army is suffering heavy losses in both of these cities. Many Russian commanders want to withdraw from these cities, but the Putin administration refuses to accept their demands. The Kremlin administration wants to win a victory because the Russian people are now constantly rebelling. The Russian people are going through hard times because of this war. The Russian economy has been badly damaged by the sanctions imposed on Russia by Western countries. Unemployment and inflation are increasing day by day in Russia. The Russian ruble continues to lose value. All investors in the Russian stock market are suffering a huge economic loss. The Putin administration wants to announce a great victory in the war to get the support of the Russian people. That's why the Russian army is operating with all its might in these two regions. But the Ukrainian army is not allowing Russia to take over these cities. The Russian army has deployed soldiers from the Wagner Group, a mercenary group in these regions, after their defeat in this region. The soldiers of the Wagner Group started to desert from the army as a result of thousands of mercenaries deserting their units. Problems began to arise between the Kremlin administration in Russia and the Wagner Group. Prigozhin, the director of the Wagner Group, is one of the most influential businessmen in Russia. Prigozhin's criticism of the Kremlin has led to a serious fall in Putin's reputation. Rogozin was expected to lead the country after Putin. Prigozhin's harsh criticism attracted great attention from the Russian public. Millions of Russians think that his criticism is justified. Putin is dealing with a new problem. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army continues to carry out very successful operations in this region. Today, the Ukrainian army challenged Russia. A senior Ukrainian military commander visited Ukrainian soldiers defending the Bakhmut and Salvador region. It is known that Colonel General Alexander Skirsky made this visit to organize the defense and to give morale to the troops. During his visit, Skirsky also spoke about the developments in the war. The enemy again made a desperate attempt to attack the city of Salvador from different directions and sent the most professional Wagner units into battle. The Kremlin was angered by the fact that Skirsky, a senior Ukrainian commander, traveled to the war zone and made a statement. The Kremlin has said that this region was about to fall under the control of the Russian army. But the general's visit to these towns was described in the Russian press as a challenge. Earlier, Russia had claimed that it had achieved complete supremacy in the Kherson region, but then the Russian army fled castle. Ukrainian President Zelensky's visit to Kherson caused outrage in Russia. The Ukrainian government is taking very important steps on these issues. The Ukrainian press made important claims on this issue today. According to some experts, Zelensky also wants to visit Bakhmut and Salvador. If Zelensky goes to the conflict zone and shoots a video from there, the course of the war could change. Zelensky surprises the whole world with his communication methods. Zelensky, who has been going to conflict zones since the beginning of the war and sharing very impressive messages for his people, is on the agenda of the whole world. Zelensky has changed all the rules of political science. Ukraine has completely seized the psychological advantage in this war. The Ukrainian people are fully convinced that Russia will lose this war. The Ukrainian army is also highly motivated and is winning the war. But this is not the case in Russia. Russian soldiers know that they will lose this war. And the Russian people are very worried about the course of this war. The support of the Russian people for this war is decreasing day by day. This situation is making Putin's job harder in Russia. Putin knows very well that he cannot win this war without the support of the Russian people. But a significant part of the Russian people continue to oppose this war. There are anti-war protests in dozens of places in Russia, including the Red Square in Moscow. Putin can no longer suppress these protests. Putin has been commissioning fake news that he has won a great victory in this war. But the Ukrainian government is succeeding in exposing this fake news. The Ukrainian authorities made a very important announcement today. The Ukrainian government has denied claims that many Kiev soldiers were killed in a Russian attack last week in Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian government, which shared images from this region with the public, exposed another Russian lie. The Russian government claimed that Ukrainian soldiers were in a student dormitory, which collapsed completely after the attack. The Ukrainian government, on the other hand, shared images of this dormitory and showed that there was no trace of any attack. The Ukrainian government statements were repeatedly shared among Russian citizens. The Russian people no longer trust Putin because of these lies. Putin is going through the most difficult days of his political career. What do you think about the Ukrainian army's operations in the cities of Bakhmut and Salvador? How do you think the psychological superiority of the Ukrainian army affects the course of this war? What do you think about the defeats suffered by the Russian army? Do you think that the exposure of Putin's government lies could lead to increased anger of the Russian people? The war between Ukraine and Russia, contrary to expectations, escalated again with the arrival of winter as the tension between Ukraine and Russia increases day by day. The Ukrainian army continues to fight to the last man and hunt down the Russians one by one. In recent weeks, things have been heating up in the Donbass region, where the most intense conflicts are experienced. The Ukrainian army has blockaded Russian troops in the east. The Ukrainian attacks are so intense that the Russians cannot get their heads out of their trenches. Since the Ukrainian army cut off the Russian supply routes, the Russians were left with no weapons that could pass through the Ukrainian defense. That's why the Russian advance stopped in most of the Donbass. Ukrainian artillery deployed around Bakhmut provides support fire to the assault troops, while Ukrainian tank troops are slow but successful in pushing the Russians back towards the border here. We should not forget the intelligence that came to the Ukrainian army. Western countries such as the USA and the UK send the intelligence they receive from the satellites over the region to the Ukrainian army minute by minute, and the Ukrainian army successfully ends the operations. They started with the right strategies. The best example of the operations carried out with the correct intelligence from Western countries came in the past days. The Ukrainian army struck a large Chechen camp located in Donbass. The Ukrainian military said it attacked a former field hospital used by pro-Russian Chechens and Russian soldiers as a base, and that 100 invaders were killed as a result of the attack. The Ukrainian Army's Strategic Communications Directorate reported that its forces launched an attack on the hospital building of a former machinery manufacturing plant in the Russian-occupied town of Kadivka, about 30 miles south of Lysychansk. The hospital building of an old machine building factory used by the Chechens as a base was destroyed by HIMARS salvos of Ukrainian artillery units. It was reported that at least 100 Chechen and Russian soldiers remained under the rubble. Russian-controlled militants in Luhansk Oblast acknowledged that Ukraine's attack on Kadiyevka and Ukraine's HIMARS attack destroyed the factory's dispensary. There were no independent reports of casualties in the reported attack, and no confirmation from Russia of the attack or the death toll. The attack came as Donetsk Oblast Governor Pavlo Kyrylenko said he had injured 4 civilians in the past day due to Russian attacks. Kyrylenko said 3 people were injured in Bakhmut and 1 in Avdiivka. Earlier this month, Russia acknowledged its worst loss ever reported after Ukrainian forces said they had struck a base in the occupied town of Makiivka in the eastern Donetsk region where Russian troops are stationed. The Russian Ministry of Defense later said that 63 soldiers were killed in a rocket attack on one of Ukraine's bases on New Year's Eve. The number of casualties was the largest incident loss Russia had recognized since President Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said in a statement that Moscow has sent additional troops to the occupied areas of Kherson Oblast, according to Kiev. Although they did not come with any military equipment, Vinogradov and Belitsk arrived at their settlements with small arms and bulletproof vests. Meanwhile, the Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement that soldiers from the Western Military District damaged Ukrainian troops in the Kharkiv and Luhansk regions and Kiev. Forces suffered more than 130 casualties in the attacks. Kherson Oblast Governor Yaroslav Yanyuzhevik said Russian troops attacked Kherson Oblast 25 times using artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, mortars and tanks, and 3 people were injured. On the other hand, according to UK intelligence, Russia's plan to expand its military faces major hurdles. The UK Ministry of Defense made an assessment of Russia's plans in an intelligence update after Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said the country plans to restructure its armed forces plans between 2023 and 2026. The app will reportedly expand to 1.5 million soldiers, an 11% increase in addition to the previously announced 1.35 million increase. But UK intelligence questioned the possibility of hitting the target, saying it signaled what Moscow believed to be a threat over the next few years. UK Mod says that Shoigu also announced the re-establishment of the Moscow and Leningrad military districts, a partial return to the Soviet-era power organization in Western Russia, and the establishment of a new Corps in Karelia. Shoigu's plans indicate that the Russian leadership is likely assessing that an advanced conventional military threat will persist for many years beyond the current Ukrainian war. However, Russia will likely push the plan to expansion in terms of personnel and equipment. The announcement comes after the Ukrainian government claimed that more than 20,000 Russian soldiers were killed last month. Ukrainian figures showed that more than 120,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the start of the full-scale invasion on February 24. If true, this indicates that more Russians died in Ukraine than U.S. soldiers in World War I. Russia does not regularly publish its own casualty figures, although it has publicly announced that less than 6,000 regular soldiers have died. The casualty rate led to a partial mobilization of the military reserve forces in Russia, including the alleged conscription of convicted criminals with serious illnesses from the country's prisons. Although the government faced little resistance to the establishment, hundreds of thousands of Russians are believed to have left the country before mobilization began. On the other hand, according to the UK Ministry of Defense, Russia and Ukraine have amassed significant forces in the key area of Zaporizhia, but the conflict there seems to have reached a stalemate. The UK Ministry of Defense reported that so far there has been no large-scale fighting in Bakhmut. UK Mod said that the heaviest conflict is focused on 3 sectors to the northeast near Kremlin. Ukraine probably made minor gains and successfully defended against a Russian counterattack around the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk Oblast. Russian and Wagner proxy forces are likely reuniting in the town of Soledar after capturing it earlier in the week. The Institute for War Studies, a US-based think tank, said in a statement that recent reports showed the Wagner Group was struggling and lacked the essential administrative bodies to keep records of individual soldiers and to communicate properly with authorities. Wagner Group founder and businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin recently clashed with Russia's defense ministry after declaring victory in capturing the town of Soledar without accepting the group's role. The ministry later released a report announcing the Wagner Group's involvement. The UK Defense Ministry says that both sides have deployed substantial forces in Zaporizhia Oblast, conducting artillery exchanges and fighting, but avoiding any large-scale offensive efforts. In general, the conflict is in a state of stalemate. However, there is a realistic possibility for Russia to advance locally around Bakhmut. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin has been warned that the Russian anti-war resistance is actively trying to kill more Kremlin elites as he ramps up his campaign to effect regime change. The Kremlin was shaken by Daria Dugina, who died in the explosion of her Toyota Land Cruiser last year. The 29-year-old was the daughter of far-right political philosopher Alexander Dugina and shared her views on Ukraine and support for Vladimir Putin. Dugin claimed that he was the main ideologue behind Russia's war in Ukraine and persuaded Putin to continue the invasion. The movement is made up of Russian partisans working to violently overthrow the Putin regime. The NR has appointed Ilya Ponomarev, a former Russian lawmaker and Putin rival, as its political representative and spokesperson to help explain its agendas to international leaders. The partisans have not attempted any further attacks on the Kremlin elite since the Dugin assassination. The biggest news is coming from the east here. After revealing that Ukrainians are supplying the Bakhmut Group via tunnels, Wagner forces decided to stop trying to cut the highways and focus on the city. However, the moment the Russians were pushed from the roads, Ukrainians sent several groups of tanks to Bakhmut and used them to demolish the streets that the Russians managed to capture. Last time I told you that Ukrainians were pushed out from their positions along the river and the device shifted closer to the center of the city. I also told you that it had been widely speculated that the Ukrainians are not planning to fight here for a long time because they have prepared the main defense line along the railways. The freshest report suggests that these speculations were correct. Recent combat footage released by a Russian war correspondent reveals that Russian forces have already reached the Beersheva Street. Judging by the video, they have already assumed positions inside this block a bit to the south. Russians have passed the stadium Middlework and reached Kowalska Street. Combat footage from this part of the town shows that Russians are trying to get closer to the railways when it comes to the stadium. Avant-garde, where 2 days ago we saw intense fights as well. Here the enemy did not manage to advance and is still located south of Kowalska Street. In the footage released several hours ago, a Russian soldier is describing a situation on the radio saying that the assault unit could not move because Ukrainians established fire control over the area with their tanks. And this is not surprising. Russian sources have been reporting for weeks about the relocation of Ukrainian tanks to Bakhmut, especially after Ukrainians conducted the first major counterattack near Ivanovsky and pushed Russians from the hill. This allowed Ukrainians to send small groups of tanks via the highway from Konstantinovka and quickly enter Bakhmut from the south without the threat of being shot with anti-tank guided missiles. Tanks are very feared in urban warfare. Russians may spend weeks to establish total control over a street, while a sudden tank assault allows them to demolish multiple houses and everyone who occupies them in under a minute. And with the abundance of garages, warehouses, and former supermarkets, it is very easy to hide the tank once it returns from a mission. Russians are also using tanks. Ukrainian 83rd Mechanized Brigade showed the aftermath of clashes between Ukrainian and Russian tanks. The Russian side also features destroyed Ukrainian tanks in the central part of the city. However, in armored warfare, just like in the infantry fights, the defending party has an advantage because it doesn't need to expose itself first. Russians cannot use this same tactic and just destroy all the houses because they need at least something to be left to be able to leverage in a future attack. Ukrainians in turn don't have to do that, and once they understand that their position is lost, they can roll out a tank and demolish Russian positions. The battle for Bakhmut took a substantial toll on Wagner forces, and we could observe a lot of indicators of that for weeks. First of all, Wagner forces were gradually but continuously reinforced with the regular Russian army, in particular airborne units, to prevent the collapse of the flanks. Secondly, the 6-month contracts with prisoners were about to end. And thirdly, Prigozhin launched an extensive recruitment campaign over the last week.